Johnny Two-Face here, back with another reaction video. This time, this will be the second part of my reaction to the Imjin War, the Japanese invasion of Korea, 1592 to 1598 by kings and generals. Now, if you haven't seen my reaction to the first part of this reaction, please go and check that part out before checking this one out. So, I said what I had said in the beginning of the last part, so, well, the first part. The usual disclaimer when I react to historical content, if I don't show so much what is considered a proper reaction, is probably obvious. I don't know much about the subject at hand, and if I do know anything, I'll most likely pause the video to give my input, or ask any curious questions, which hopefully will be answered in the comments. With that being said, the link to the original video will be in the description down below. Please go and subscribe to Kings and Generals, another amazing history channel here on YouTube, and there's not much more I can say, so I'm just gonna full screen that, get that up, make sure subtitles are on. Okay, here we go. And it keeps doing that. Okay.
Admiral Wan wanted to just attack Yasaharu's fleet, but Yi refused. Rather than meeting Yasaharu's fleet in the narrows of Gyeonnaeryang, where Yi's ships might collide with one another, he sent 6 Panoksun warships forward as bait for a trap. When these ships emerged into visual range of the enemy, they switched direction and fled. Predictably, the victory-hungry Japanese fleet came barreling in pursuit. As they emerged into the open sea, the Korean fleet spread into a semicircular crane's wing formation, light vessels on the flanks, while the heavier ships formed a sturdy center. When everything was in place, Yi ordered a charge. Immediately, the more nimble wings enveloped all of Yasaharu's vessels, darting in and out whilst showering the enemy with cannon fire and archery. At the same time, the heavier center, fronted by 3 turtle ships, smashed directly into the enemy formation. Shooting from all sides, the monstrous turtle ships tore many Japanese ships apart with cannon, while the heavy Panoksun warships stayed at a distance, using their advantage in artillery to tear into the Japanese. In particular, metal case firebombs were shot from mortars located on the decks of the Panoksun craft. Only when the opposing ships were crippled did the admiral give the order to board and finish them off in melee. After many hours of this drubbing, Yasaharu realized he was defeated and fled to a fast ship, barely managing to escape. 2 of his relatives, Wakizaka Sabe and Watanabe Shichiemon, were not so lucky and were killed in the fighting. Of 82 Japanese vessels that had sailed through Gyeonnaeryang that day, only 14 survived the Battle of Hansando. The 2 colleagues of Yasaharu, whom he had left behind before the battle, Yoshitaka and Yoshiaki, were quickly informed of the disaster. They set sail immediately and reached Angelpo, where they ran into the battered remnants of Yasaharu's forces. 1 day later, on the 16th of August 1592, favourable winds prompted Yi to follow his defeated foe, arriving outside the Angelpo harbour and deploying his navy in the Crane's Wing formation once again.
Sorry, it keeps bringing me out of full screen every time I click the center. If you remember from the first part, it talked about how the turtle ships were the brainchild of Admiral Yi Sun-chin, the only historical figure, that I know of from Korean history. And by the looks of it, it's such an amazing ship build. And his tactics, by the looks of it, look second to none when it comes to this point in time in this region. Mind you, having the home field advantage does help.
This time he faced a total of 42 Japanese warships at anchor, protected by their own armaments, land fortifications on the nearby coast, and shallow waters in the bay itself. Yi first attempted to lure the Japanese out with bait, as he had many times before,
They
But
probably
the
learned.
Hansando
Yeah.
experience wizened his enemy to that tactic, and it garnered no response. Instead, the Korean admiral changed tactics, arranging for a continuous relay of ship squadrons to row into cannon range, unleash their destructive artillery volleys on the Japanese, and then withdraw to safety. This rolling bombardment was devastatingly successful. Almost all of the pirates, as Yi called them, were killed, especially on the larger craft, which had been the primary targets. Seeing that a few ships had been left undamaged, Yi now called his vessels off. Many Japanese had escaped to the nearby shore, and would probably wreak a terrible vengeance on Korean civilians if their means of escape was destroyed. Aiming to avoid unnecessary suffering among his people, the Joseon fleet withdrew to open water for the night.
That's clever. I can see now why Admiral Yi Sun-shin was probably one of the best Navy admirals in Asia. Sorry, don't know why I'm got so tongue twisted on that one. Yeah, so yeah, now we see why he's one of the best admirals in Asian history, and probably the best in Korean history.
When they returned at dawn the following day, all Japanese survivors had fled, and the local inhabitants were unharmed.
Wow.
Yi still had not lost a single vessel in combat. At this point, Yi began to receive troubling reports that Ashigaru land armies were advancing into Cholla, and consequently withdrew to his base at Yosu. Though some Japanese prisoners had escaped the admiral's wrath, it was only a minor speck on what had otherwise been a great naval campaign. Yi's success was impressive. He was beginning to strangle the life out of Japan's invasion, but his rise to become the national hero of Korea was only just beginning. While Yi Sun-shin was making a name for himself in the seas of the south, in the north of the country, the Japanese general Kato Kiyomasa sought to gain more glory as well. In early September, and after capturing and sending 2 Korean princes down to Gyeongseong with an armed escort of 1,000 men, Kato prepared for a short incursion into Manchuria, where Jurchen tribes lived. The Japanese called these people Orangai, from the Korean word Oranke, which means barbarian.
Okay.
This symbolic expedition against the barbarians across the Tumen River served a more practical purpose as well. Kiyomasa would be able to test his army against a possible future foe, and collect invaluable information as to how the semi-nomadic Jurchens fought. To aid him in this new military endeavor, he recruited Koreans from the Hamgyong province to act as his guides and vanguard. The locals had no love for the northern barbarians, as the latter frequently raided their villages, so they were more than eager to offer their services to the Japanese, and a sizable force of 3,000.
So does this mean the Jurchens worked with the Gando region here, or is that under occupation from another force? If you can answer that in the comments, that'll be much appreciated.
1,000 Korean allies was assembled, ready to serve Kiyomasa. With his army now totaling around 11,000 men, Kato Kiyomasa became the first Japanese general to cross into China. Unbeknownst to him, he would also be the only one to do so at that time. They soon came upon an Orangai castle, and at dawn, the Japanese drew up their ranks and prepared for an assault. However, they soon became aware that even though the castle seemed formidable, it was lightly defended. As such, the Koreans advanced on the front of the fort, while the Japanese troops went around the mountain to the rear of the fortress, and working in groups of 50 or 30, they managed to pull out the stones using crowbars, and the wall collapsed. The Japanese entered the castle, and after some fierce arquebus volleys, they killed the small garrison and captured the Jurchen fortress.
Wow.
Despite this success, Kiyomasa, perhaps knowing that a Jurchen counterattack was incoming, decided to pull back towards the Korean border and made camp for the night on a hill. The following morning, the Koreans headed back across the Tumen, leaving the Japanese to face an army of around 10,000 angry Jurchens. Although Kiyomasa's chronicler informs us that for every Japanese dead, the Jurchens suffered 30 casualties,
Wow.
the attackers refused to give up and continued their ferocious assault. So fierce was the fight that at one point Kiyomasa's standard bearer was killed next to him, and the Japanese general had to hold it with his own hands. He also gave orders that the heads of the enemies were not to be collected as trophies, but only counted, for every samurai was needed for the fight. Even after 8,000 heads were tallied, the Jurchens continued to fight. Their attack finally came to a stop when an exceptionally heavy rain started falling in a way that it blew directly into their faces, and so they withdrew. Well satisfied with his troops' performance and the results of this short campaign, Kato Kiyomasa crossed in turn the Tumen River and continued eastwards towards the sea, capturing a series of Korean forts along the way.
Mind you, this is I could be wrong, but it's probably first time the Jurchens have faced the Japanese. Not used to such a formidable enemy.
Kato Kiyomasa's scouting expedition to Manchuria was the closest the Japanese reached to invading China, their true objective. But to amass a force large enough to invade the Middle Kingdom, they needed to dominate the sea around Korea. However, Admiral Yi inflicted defeat upon defeat on the Japanese navy, and 1 month after Kiyomasa's incursion over the Tumen River, he would strike again, putting an end to Japanese ambitions of invading China. Following the extraordinary success of the Hansando Angulpo campaign, Admiral Yi had returned to his base at Yosu in Chola province. There his fleet was reinforced, with ships that had been hastily put into production upon the outbreak of the war. With 166 vessels under his command, 74 being large battleships, Yi Sun-shin fathomed a plan to wash away the national disgrace and directly attack Busan. Joined by fellow commanders Yi Ok and Won Kyun, he reached the estuary of the Naktong River on the 4th of October and sent a scouting raft that came back reporting that 500 Japanese ships were anchored inside the city's harbor. The size of the Japanese fleet didn't seem to deter the Korean admiral, who, emboldened by his previous victories, decided to attack the following day. Facing a strong east wind and fighting against the rough seas, the Korean fleet made its way towards Busan. In the waters just off the harbor, they encountered 24 Japanese ships organized in small groups. These ships were easily burned and destroyed, and the Koreans entered the harbor itself, witnessing the Japanese armada that was split into 3 large masses anchored near the shore. The Japanese crews, realizing that there was no time to set sail and fight the enemy at sea, jumped overboard and headed for fortifications on the heights above the shore, from where they would mount their defense. Just like Sacheon, the Koreans approached as closely as they could and bombarded the unmanned Japanese ships with their cannons, while also showering them with fire arrows. The Japanese, well protected behind their fortifications, tried to prevent the destruction of their fleet by unleashing barrages of musket fire and arrows, and making use of Korean cannons that had been captured in Busan and Dongnae, whereas others were frantically trying to repair their damaged ships. However, only the coming of night could stop the Koreans, who withdrew to the open sea after destroying 130 Japanese vessels. On the other hand, only 5 Koreans died during the battle, and 25 were wounded. This time as well, Admiral Yi lost no ships. Emboldened by his triumphant victory, he initially wanted to return to Busan the following morning and inflict further damage upon the Japanese, but reconsidered his choice as the sinking of the entire fleet would leave the invaders trapped in Korea with no avenue of retreat, something Sun Tzu in his Art of War advises against. The defeat at Busan and the loss of around a quarter of their fleet extinguished any lingering hopes the Japanese might have of amassing an army in the north large enough to invade China. The victories Admiral Yi Sun-shin had won at sea had prevented the entry of his Japanese foes into the Yellow Sea, rendering them unable to reinforce and resupply their armies on land. Meanwhile, Korean ground forces behind the Japanese lines were doing the same. In the countryside and wilderness, guerrilla armies began to form almost immediately, reacting to the cruelty they and their countrymen experienced at the hands of the enemy. Resistance leaders such as Ko Kyung-myung, Cho Hon, and Kwak Chae-woo set up ambushes to trap enemy troops and preyed on vulnerable Japanese supply barges that were using Korea's rivers for transport. These actions further hampered the logistics of Toyotomi Hideyoshi's conquering army in much the same way Admiral Yi was doing at sea. Motivated partly by patriotism and partly by a desire to raise the social status of their kin, an estimated 22,000 irregular fighters and 84,500 regular soldiers from the Yalu River in the north to the Naktong Delta in the south rejoined the fight as guerrilla warriors in 1592, among them 8,000 Buddhist monks. In November of 1592, Korean guerrilla forces contributed to the successful defense of Jinju, a battle which caused many Japanese casualties and humiliated the daimyo generals. Most crucially, all of the chaos behind Hideyoshi's lines was giving Korea time, and time was exactly what Korea needed. The bastion which guarded Chola province, Castle Jinju, had a reputation of being unassailable. Still untouched by the war, Chola represented the potential of loot for the invading Japanese troops. It also served as the hideout for Gwakjeyu's Righteous Army, one of the partisan groups assailing Japanese supply lines. Thus, Ukita Hideiie and Hosokawa Tadaoki agreed that they had to capture Jinju, and so they dispatched a 20,000-man strong army under the leadership of Kato Mitsuyasu, Hasegawa Hidekazu, Nagaoka Tadaoki, and Kimura Shigeji, which, after reconquering Changwon, arrived outside the walls of Jinju on November 8th. Guarding the fortress was a 3,800-strong Korean garrison, led by Kim Shi-min, who was determined to hold the fortified city. Despite being direly outnumbered, the Koreans had one advantage: their artillery, for they were well equipped with cannons, mortars, and bombs, as well as 170 new arquebuses that were equal to those the Japanese used. The Japanese army advanced from three sides, and once the Ashigaru gunners were in firing range, they unleashed a volley in an attempt to scare the garrison into surrendering the castle without a fight. This ploy had paid off in the past, but it wouldn't work this time around. As the Japanese came closer to the walls, the defenders unleashed hell, as arquebus fire, bombs, and heavy stones fell on the attackers, who weren't expecting such stiff resistance. After falling back for a while, the Japanese resumed their offensive, this time under the cover of shields made of bamboo, and massed volleys from their arquebusiers. When the besiegers reached the walls, they placed scaling ladders, but the defenders, ignoring the bullets, used axes and stones to smash the ladders.
Wow.
Japanese laborers also constructed a siege tower, and from its advantageous height, the Ashigaru fired over the walls and into the city. For 3 days, wave upon wave of Japanese attackers crashed on the walls of Jinju, only to be pushed back by a hail of projectiles from the defenders, who even threw flaming bundles of straw filled with gunpowder down upon their foes. Finally, on the night of the 11th, groups belonging to the Righteous Army sent by Gwakjeu arrived to aid in the defense of the castle. Because they were too few to be an effective relief force, they went up on a nearby hill, where they lit many torches, so as to trick the Japanese into thinking that a large force had flanked them. The guerrillas were soon joined by 3,000 more men, forcing the Japanese to divert a portion of their troops to guard against an attack from them. Despite that, the besiegers remained focused on their objective, but were still unable to overcome the staunch Korean defense. On the final day, the Japanese decided that if brute force wasn't enough, then maybe a clever stratagem could work. In the early morning hours of November the 13th, they illuminated their camp with more torches than usual so as to be visible by the Koreans, and pretended to pack up their gear and prepare to leave. At the time of a given signal, the torches were extinguished, and an all-out assault on the opposite side of the city, along the northern and eastern gates, was launched. The Koreans rushed to defend, with Kim Shi-min in the van, fighting beside his men, only to have a bullet mortally wound him in the left of his forehead. But this was kept from his men so they would not lose heart. The Korean garrison was already in a perilous situation, as ammunition was running low, but they were saved when a Korean detachment arrived by boat up the Nam River, bringing with them supplies and encouraging the defenders to continue. With casualties once more piling high, the Japanese commanders halted the attack. Fearing a counterattack from the rear, they decided, much to Hideyoshi's fury, to abandon the siege altogether and head back to Changwon under the cover of a sudden downpour. The Korean army, exhausted and low on supplies and ammunition, didn't attempt to pursue the retreating Japanese.
Smart.
The situation was about to become a lot worse for the Japanese, when in late 1592, Ming China, which had long been a suzerain and protector of Korea, finally began its intervention in the war. Initially, a Chinese expeditionary force of 3,000 troops, under the command of the reckless Zhu Chengshun, was ordered to take Pyongyang, but was destroyed when it became trapped and outnumbered inside the city.
Wow.
While this victory made the Japanese optimistic at first, the samurai commanders soon realized that the Chinese would be back soon and in massive numbers. Worried about this and the vulnerable state of Pyongyang, Kenichi Yukinaga went south to Seoul in order to meet with his supreme commander Ukita Hide.
Correct me if I'm wrong, and bear in mind I am going off my knowledge from Age of Empires 2. I think one of the best things about the Chinese army at this time was their ranged attackers. I think their crossbowman was called Chukanu, which is named after the crossbow, which was like I think it was nicknamed a rapid firing crossbow, but I could be wrong. Feel free to correct me in the comments about that. Again, that's just what I remember from Age of Empires 2. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong as well, as Chukanu. A rapid fire crossbow. Oh, and it keeps doing that.
DEA, so that they might discuss these urgent matters. It turns out that Japanese anxieties were justified, for in January of 1593, after crushing the Ningxia revolt back home, the Chinese commander Li Rusong slowly led a large army of Ming troops into Korea, wisely using scouts and spies to gather intelligence on Japanese positions as he advanced. After some minor skirmishes, Li Rusong's forces approached Pyongyang on February 5th. An initial Japanese sortie from the gates was crushed by a feigned retreat, but it was clear that recapturing the city would present a massive challenge. Pyongyang enjoyed a strong defensive position, flanked to the east by the Taedong River and northwest by the Patong River. Moreover, it possessed some of Korea's most formidable walls, which had been continuously reinforced throughout the centuries, forming a crude, elongated triangle lying between the two rivers, within which were 6 gates. Meanwhile, the entrances along the Taedong River were lightly defended, with each of the 4 landward gates garrisoned by 2,000 Japanese soldiers apiece. Moreover, Kenichi Yukinaga and 2,000 elite bodyguard troops were deployed on Mount Moranbong, a 70-meter-high fortified vista from which a commanding view of the surroundings could be had. Overall, roughly 15,000 men of the first contingent defended Pyongyang. By the time he arrived at Pyongyang, Li Rusong's 43,000-strong imperial army had been further swollen by many thousands of Koreans and 5,000 warrior monks. He set up his own headquarters on high ground west of the Patong River, personally commanding 9,000 troops. Around the city, the general distributed various detachments under his subordinates to assault the various gates. 10,000 soldiers under Zhang Shijie were set up opposite the Chilsong Gate. 11,000 under Yang Yuan formed up facing the Patong Gate, and a further 10,000 under Li Rubo prepared to assault the Hanggu Gate. Finally, 9,000 Koreans under their native commanders Yi Il and Kim Il-so were ordered to the Changyong Gate. The Chinese cannons, capable of firing large stones over 2 kilometers, were distributed evenly around the siege lines under heavy guard.
Of course, I forgot it was the Chinese who were technically the first to use gunpowder or black powder powered artillery. Because you think before this, like, armies used to use like ballistas or catapults or trebuchets, but I think it was the Chinese, were the first to use gunpowder weapons. But anyway.
After an attempt to assassinate Kenichi Yukinaga failed, the assault began. Spearheading the assault were 3,000 warrior monks, capable warriors under the command of Hu Zhong, a master monk. On the morning of February 6, 1593, these brave religious warriors advanced up the northern slope of Mount Moranbong, attempting to scale the hill walls. In the face of withering arquebus fire from the Japanese on the fortifications, they suffered hundreds of casualties, but persevered nonetheless. As the defenders began to tire in the late afternoon, the monks were joined by a Chinese unit under Wu Weizhong, whose troops began to scale Mount Moranbong from the west. This contingent began to breach the area, streaming onto the mountain behind Yukonaga's lines. All of a sudden, Yukonaga was surrounded, and there was a danger he would be killed. At that moment, So Yoshitomo, a compatriot of Yukonaga, led a counterattack from the main city and broke the Chinese encirclement on Mount Moranbong, allowing the remnants of Yukonaga's 2,000-strong guard to retreat. That evening, the Japanese abandoned the mountain, instead taking up positions in their recently constructed citadel, a construction of primitive earthworks. The next morning, Li Rusong ordered a general assault on Pyongyang with all forces engaged. As the first blast of cannon fire sounded, the general advanced at the head of his troops, only to be met with a storm of Japanese arquebus fire, rocks, arrows, and boiling water. Aiming to blunt this dogged resistance, Ming cannons continuously battered the walls and gates of Pyongyang, aiming to soften them up. At the same time, incendiary bombs and fire arrows were loosed into the city itself, causing chaos, setting fire to buildings and even the forest outside of the city. Under the hail of projectiles, Chinese and Joseon casualties mounted, forming mounds of corpses which their comrades climbed upon to advance. To further stiffen his men's resolve, Li Rusong publicly killed a deserting soldier and then offered 5,000 ounces of silver to any brave man who would breach the walls first. With the unbearable pressure of artillery bombardment and the infantry assault, in addition to the employment of the famous cloud ladders of Chinese siege warfare, Pyongyang's defenses broke. The Chilsong Gate and the surrounding wall collapsed, allowing Ming troops and surviving warrior monks inside. Meanwhile, at the shattered Putong Gate, Luo Shangji, swinging his halberd, was one of the first to enter the city. Now, under intense pressure, the defensive ring along the walls of Pyongyang fell apart, resulting in a Japanese withdrawal to the inner citadel. This hastily constructed fortification was apparently built with holes in its side for arquebusiers to fire through, which caused it to look like a beehive. The sophisticated Chinese officers, looking with scorn at the primitive and barbarian citadel, immediately ordered an assault in mass ranks. This proved to be a dreadful mistake. Japanese troops fired volley after volley of arquebus shots into the tightly packed Ming and Korean soldiers, causing massive casualties and breaking the assault's momentum. When Yukonaga saw some enemies retreating from the city altogether, he led a sortie from the citadel in an attempt to break the siege, but was methodically driven back by concentrated Chinese cannon fire. As daylight waned, the Japanese were still in control of the inner fortress, but were badly bloodied. Li Rusong decided to pull his men back for the night so they could rest. Meanwhile, inside the citadel, Yukonaga held a war council. It was quickly decided their position was untenable, and the Japanese decided to retreat. Under the cover of darkness, the entire remaining garrison quietly withdrew through the Changyong Gate and across the frozen Taedong River. According to samurai Yoshinojin Gozeemon, who was present during the retreat, wounded men were routinely abandoned, while those exhausted men simply crawled along the road. Yukonaga's men hoped to rest at a communication fort at Pungsan, but it had been abandoned by its commander, who assumed Yukonaga had already been annihilated. This Ming-dominated victory at Pyongyang was a change in momentum. While at the start of the war, the Japanese had seemed unstoppable, it was now Li Rusong's army that advanced, and the Japanese who were in a headlong retreat. Nevertheless, the Japanese 6th contingent under Kobayakawa Takakage managed to lure Li into a trap, defeating his army at the Battle of Byeokjigwan. This would prove to be one of the biggest pitched battles of the invasion, and one which the Chinese general only narrowly escaped before withdrawing his army north to recover. Having heard of the Ming victories in the north and at Pyongyang, a gifted Korean general known as Guan Yu marched 2,300 troops to garrison the fortress of Hangju, located on a hill 13 kilometers north of Seoul. The delay caused by Li Rusong's tactical defeat gave the Japanese some breathing room, and allowed Ukita Hideie to march straight at Hangju with 30,000 soldiers, among whom included the reconstituted forces of Yukinaga, who had regrouped after fleeing Pyongyang. They would soon meet Guan Yu's army in the field, fully expecting to crush the tiny and bothersome force without any issue. However, the ensuing battle would not go the way the Japanese were expecting it to. At 6 AM on the 14th of March 1593, Ukita's army encircled Hangzhou and marched up the slopes leading up to it from all directions. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, however, the Koreans were waiting and ready for them. Dug in behind formidable entrenchments, Guan Yu's forces sent a barrage of bowfire, arquebus shots, delayed action mortar bombs, rocks, and even tree trunks down on the attackers. Most infamous were the Korean Hwacha, medieval rocket launchers capable of loading up to 100 steel-tipped rockets. Despite this rabidly fearsome defense, Japan's numerical superiority paid off, and the Koreans were forced back to the second defensive line. But their artillery caused devastating casualties upon the massed Japanese waves. 9 attacks were made in total, and all 9 attacks were repelled. Overall, some sources claim up to 10,000 attackers ended up dead or wounded. Outnumbered by more than 10 to 1, Guan Yu had gained victory. This remarkable triumph prompted the Chinese commander Li Rusong to once again move south. Having been despondent after his prior defeat against the Japanese, his huge Ming army now advanced south once again. In Seoul, the situation was horrible for the Japanese soldiery. Frostbite, starvation, and disease had worn down the expeditionary army to around 53,000 total troops from its original 150,000, and it was clear that operations would need to cease for the time being. The remaining armies of Japan decided on a southward retreat to their coastal fortress at Busan, and as a result, the Chinese army liberated Seoul on May 19th.
Wow.
After this, logistical constraints and a cautious approach meant that the war ground down into a stalemate, with neither side making any decisive movements. Diplomacy also took place during this unenforced truce, and Li Rusong sent envoys to meet with the daimyo generals in Busan, discussing topics such as troop withdrawal from the provinces and assigning blame for the war. Nevertheless, this was not an indication that Japan was militarily spent, and the generals now began to prepare for a punitive destruction of Jinju. Hideyoshi's forces had failed to take the strongly fortified city in 1592, much to their humiliation and dishonor, and they would now avenge that loss. So, despite negotiating with the Ming Chinese at the same time, Hideyoshi sent the order to wipe Jinju off the map.
Wow.
Having heard of the Japanese plans, the Koreans had managed to assemble around 4,000 troops in the city, ready to defend it to the death. On the 20th of July 1593, Supreme Commander Ukita Hideye arrived outside the city with an army 90,000 men strong, swollen by recent reinforcements from the homeland. To the western edge of the city, Kenichi Yukinaga commanded 26,000 men, while his rival Kato Kiyomasa led 25,000 to the north. On the eastern flank of Jinju was Ukita Hideye himself, with 17,000 troops under his leadership. Behind these assault forces was a ring of Japanese troops facing outward, to guard against any possible Ming assault on their siege lines. Furthermore, the besieging army placed contingents on the hills near the city in order to repel any reinforcements that came to relieve Jinju. To the northwest, Kobayakawa Takakage, the victor of Byokjaguan, held authority over 8,700 troops, while Mori Hidemoto was stationed to the northeast with 13,000. Finally, Kakawa Hirai had several thousand more across the Nam River to clean up any trouble to the city's south. Throughout July 21st, the Japanese labored to drain the newly built moat outside the city. In this, they found limited success, as outer sections of the dikes were destroyed and the channel was filled with rocks, earth, and brushwood. This set the stage for a general attack on the landward side of the city the next day. Using scaling ladders to storm the walls, Japanese troops fought fiercely and almost penetrated the city's defenses, but clever Korean use of artillery and fire arrows drove them back. As the 23rd dawned, large and static siege towers were constructed in order to facilitate observation and arquebus fire into the city. However, this was not successful, as destructive Korean cannon fire shot the towers to pieces one by one. Things seemed to be looking better for the defenders when a local army marched toward Jinju from the east in an attempt to relieve it. However, these reinforcements were quickly pushed away by Hidemoto's northeast rearguard. On July 25th, Hideie sent a message into the castle, calling on Kim Chonil, the garrison commander, to surrender. The supreme commander received no reply. Japanese forces tried again on the 26th. This time, a series of tortoise-shell wagons with boarded roofs were constructed, providing protection for advancing troops, while sappers mined foundation stones from the ramparts. It made some progress, but this assault was pushed back when bundles of combustibles dropped off the walls were set alight, burning the protective shells. Nevertheless, it was becoming clear that the garrison was running out of things to throw at Hideie's army. Undaunted by the previous failure, Kato Kiyomasa ordered that new tortoise wagons were to be readied, and this time fireproofed, by covering them with oxhide.
Wow.
On the 27th, a new attack began.
Well, it's one of those situations where if I had it in my editing software, I'll put the more you know. I didn't know oxhide was inflammatory or fireproof in a way. I think it's got to be more to that than oxhide. Feel free to tell me in the comments.
Which focused on the cornerstones of the northeastern section of the wall. During the day, a heavy rainstorm broke out, which undermined the foundations, eventually collapsing this pressured section.
Wow.
Taking advantage of the breach, Japanese troops began to storm the city through the gap. Korean resistance collapsed almost immediately after this. Kim Chonil, observing events from a tower in the center of Jinju, decided to commit suicide rather than surrender to the enemy.
Wow.
This was the end of Jinju. Terrified civilians and soldiers alike attempted to flee a brutal ensuing massacre by jumping into the Nam River, but were cruelly cut down on the far bank by Kikawa's troops. When the chaos was over, Japanese records claim that 20,000 heads were taken in total, while Korean annals claim 60,000 died at Jinju, a testament to Japanese barbarism. The Nam River flowed red with blood that night, and its banks were choked with headless corpses as far as the eye could see. Despite the totality and brutality of this Japanese victory, it did little to change the overall course of the war. Soon, the Japanese were forced to retreat back to the chain of coastal fortresses they controlled in the south, known as Wajo. Negotiations began, a ceasefire was imposed, and a Ming emissary was sent to Japan to discuss terms with Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Gradually, the daimyo and their men started to return to their homeland. To the north, the Chinese also withdrew their expeditionary force home. Though peace talks would continue for years after this, and the first invasion of Korea was essentially over, the war was not done. King Seonjo arrived back in the Joseon capital of Seoul on October 24, 1593, after an exile of more than a year. Though the majority of his country had been reclaimed, it was completely drained of resources and its population in the grips of terrible famine. Royal treasuries sat empty, many productive settlements had been destroyed, and much economic devastation had been caused by the war. The rebuilding effort would be headed by newly appointed Prime Minister Ryu Song-rong, who prioritized national defense. All over the nation, and especially in the Japanese-occupied south, the Joseon government began to construct impregnable mountain fortresses, situated to take advantage of terrain. Furthermore, modernization reforms in the Joseon military were undertaken from late 1593 onwards. Unit organization was tuned and adjusted, and new weapons such as modern firearms and more advanced battle tactics were adopted. Reconstruction throughout the following years gradually brought normalcy back to Korean life, but this also came with the dangers which had plagued King Seongjo's government before the war, as factional court politics now re-emerged. The labyrinthine rivalry between Westerner and Easterner factions reignited with greater intensity than before. The Prime Minister was a prominent member of the Easterner faction, but going after a man of his lofty status was too dangerous, so his enemies decided on a softer target. Admiral Yi Sun-shin was a childhood friend of Ryu Song-rong and had recently been promoted to commander of the Korean Navy in the south. In discrediting this decorated admiral, the Westerners had a mole. Yi's underling Won Gyun, who during the first Japanese invasion had cunningly intrigued against the victorious Yi, constantly sending unfavorable reports northward, grounded in nothing but lies. This factional infighting did not bode well, especially since, as they were happening, diplomatic failures between Japan and China had provoked Toyotomi Hideyoshi into preparing a second invasion. In comparison to the grand continental conquest envisioned in the prior assault, this second attack was to be a simple grab for Korea's southern half. One of the most important lessons learned by the daimyo was just how critical of a threat the Korean Navy was. So the Japanese commanders aimed to achieve supremacy at sea by two means: assembling a far stronger fleet than the one before, and weakening the enemy fleet by neutralizing its prodigious commander, Admiral Yi. To that end, Japanese forces began heavily reinforcing their armies in Korea. In addition to the roughly 20,000 remaining garrison troops in the coastal Wajjo fortresses, 121,000 more soldiers were to be mobilized. Under the supreme authority of the 15-year-old Kobayakawa Hideaki, Japanese soldiers ever so slowly began returning to enemy soil in March of 1597. After they did, Hideyoshi's forces did not launch an instant assault, but instead stalled for months on end, waiting for harvest season. By plundering local farmers during this plentiful time of year, the Japanese forces could live off the land more easily, relatively unaided by vulnerable supply lines. Moreover, Hideyoshi's plan was to march through the southwest province of Chola, known as the breadbasket of Korea. Before the land invasion even began, events at sea were to prove utterly disastrous.
Well, the thing is, the Japanese can take advantage of the infighting within the Korean court, especially when Won Gyun is who for some reason wants to undermine Yi Sun-shin, even though Yi Sun-shin has helped him multiple times.
For the defenders, as Japanese intrigue bore.
I suppose it's down to jealousy or something, because he's becoming too good at his job. And it keeps doing that.
Fruit. Kenichi Yukinaga sent a spy named Yujiro to inform the Korean High Command that he was eager to extinguish his rival, Kato Kiyomasa, for good. To this end, he provided a precise location as to where the lethal Korean Navy could easily ambush the hated commander at sea. The gullible Joseon court believed him and sent Yi Sun-shin the order to prepare the attack. Upon receiving this order, Admiral Yi was immediately suspicious. Not trusting the Japanese given information and thinking that this sounded far too easy, the Admiral refused to obey. In response, officials were dispatched to depose and arrest the heroic naval commander, replacing him with none other than the wily intriguer himself, Won Gyun, who immediately began proving himself totally incompetent. Yi avoided execution by the skin of his teeth, but was demoted to the status of a common soldier. This Japanese ploy had worked wonders, and it seemed the dangerous Admiral Yi was neutralized forever. Soon after this, Yujiro once again informed the Joseon court of a location they could easily ambush another Japanese fleet. This time, however, Admiral Yi was not present to advise caution. On the 17th of August, Admiral Won Kyun, heavily pressed by his superior, Kwon Yul, gathered the entire Korean fleet, slightly over 200 ships, and set sail eastwards to...
It also shows the corruption within the Joseon court as well. And how much, I hate to say it, they're a bunch of gullible idiots.
Towards Busan. However, the Japanese were well informed of the movements of the Korean fleet through their network of spies on the hills that overlooked Hansan-do. 3 days later, as the Korean ships neared Cholyong-do, they encountered the main Japanese fleet, which numbered 500 to 1,000 ships strong, already arrayed in a vast line. The battle had not even begun, and the Koreans were already on the back foot, exhausted from the long day at sea, and with little faith in their leader's abilities. Despite the odds being heavily stacked against him, Won Kyun ordered a general attack. The Japanese feigned a retreat, with the Koreans pursuing them, but afterwards they turned and drove them back. After repeatedly moving back and forth, the Japanese decided to finally attack with all their might. In this charge, they managed to destroy 30 Korean vessels, and because of this, the rest of the terrified Korean fleet soon routed. Despite this, the disaster was not yet over. Some of the ships, having reached Kadok Island, decided to make a quick stop to refresh their supplies in water. The island was garrisoned by a large Japanese force, and soon they were met with 3,000 soldiers under Shimazu Yoshihiro's banner, who killed about 400 Koreans and destroyed several more vessels. Whatever remained from the Korean fleet continued to retreat until they reached Chilcholyang, a narrow strait between Koje and Chilchon Island, and stayed there for a week. The defeat at Busan and the reprimand he received from Guan Yu severely crippled Won's morale, who retired to his flagship and refused to talk to anyone, thus leaving the fleet headless. The Japanese, after having experienced defeat at the hands of Yi Sun-shin time and again, were now eager to exploit this naval success to its fullest, and so they pursued the Korean fleet westwards. Unaware of the incoming Japanese attack, Won Kyun did little to plan a defense or boost his men's morale. Finally, a few hours after midnight on August 28th, the Japanese fleet, numbering almost 500 ships and under the light of a full moon, reached Chilcholyang. 3 guns signaled the attack, and the Japanese fell upon their prey with arrows and gunfire. Any Korean ships which weren't set on fire were boarded, with their crews cut down. The Koreans, who were unaccustomed to night warfare and thoroughly demoralized, offered little resistance. Some of them tried to escape by landing on the nearby Koje Island, but as it had been on Kadok Island, they were met with a Japanese ambush party who mowed them down. Admiral Won also met his fate as he was trying to escape to the mainland. By dawn, all but 13 ships would be lost. These ships were commanded by Bae Sol, who, having realized that the strait was a dangerous spot, had moved them further away. These 13 ships would later become the saviors of Korea at Myeongdong. News of the disaster reached Seoul soon after it occurred, and the king swiftly made the only decision he could, reinstating the disgraced Yi Sun-shin as supreme naval commander. With the seas around Korea now swept clean of enemy ships, the 2 Japanese ground thrusts began on September 11th, comprising Okita Hideie's 49,600-strong left army and Mori Hidetomo's 65,300-strong right army. This was to be a brutal and pitiless invasion, undertaken with a degree of savagery unseen in 1592. Hideyoshi's orders now were to mow down everyone universally, without discriminating between young and old, men and women, clergy and laity. With this in mind, the advance began. The army of the left marched through Chola province and reached the fortified town of Namwon on the 23rd of September 1597. The city was situated on a flat plain, with its only natural defense being a river flowing to the south that acted as a rather distant moat. Its walls were not very tall, about 4 meters high, but were plastered with shell lime, and tiny fragments of seashells made it glitter in the sun, creating an impressive spectacle. Between each gate and wall corner, a bastion was formed to provide flanking fire onto the gates. In the area around the city, there was an alternative defensive position just to the north, the Sanseong of Kyoyong. This mountain fortress was naturally more suited to withstand the Japanese attack, as the enemy would have to fight an uphill battle through a heavily forested area. Because of this, the Korean garrison of Namwon had advocated for abandoning the city and moving there. However, the Ming general Yang Yuan, perhaps more confident in defending a Chinese-style fortification, overruled them and chose to stay in Namwon, a decision that would later prove to be fatal. To Yang Yuan's credit, the Ming general didn't sit idly waiting for the arrival of the Japanese, but worked to strengthen the city's defenses. Another 3 meters were added to the wall's height, and cannons were placed on the main gatehouses. The defenders also dug a ditch 6 meters deep, enclosed by a wooden palisade, while spiked tree trunks were laid at its bottom to slow down the Japanese assault. Furthermore, a fortified water reservoir was built outside the walls to prepare the city for a lengthy siege, and fences were constructed on the fields. Finally, as the defenses were almost complete, Yang Yuan ordered the destruction of Kyoyong to prevent the coming Japanese from using it. When the
of a good
Japanese
idea.
army arrived, they immediately besieged the city from all sides, leaving no escape routes for the 12,000 people now trapped inside. Half of them were civilians. Hideie was in command of the southern sector, while Kanishi Yukinaga commanded the west. Kurashima Michifusa and Kato Yoshiaka's troops covered the northern side, and 11 other generals secured the eastern approach. Seeing that the invaders were busy with constructing their own defences, the besieged garrison decided to sally out, but were met with rapid volleys of arquebus fire and were forced to retreat into the city. The next day, the Japanese started filling the city's defensive ditch with earth and straw, all while under heavy cannon, musket and arrow fire from the walls. When this was done, many of their own arquebusiers crossed over, and by taking cover in the burnt houses and the fences outside the walls, began to harass the defenders. That following evening, the Japanese sent a delegation asking for the defenders to surrender. This offer was, like on all other occasions, rejected. As a result, the Japanese resumed their offense with increased fervor, which continued well into the night despite heavy rain. The solution to the stalemate came for the besiegers in the form of a clever stratagem. Witnessing the still green rice stalks on the nearby fields, they cut them, then tied them together in big bundles. When darkness began to fall, the Japanese unleashed a heavy cannon barrage, accompanied by arquebus fire that lasted for 2 hours and forced the defenders to keep their heads down. Under the cover of night and the suppressive volleys of their guns, they quietly built a ramp out of the rice stalks. As the barrage stopped, the Japanese troops assaulted the walls, with the samurai Matsuura Shigenobu reportedly leading the way. Despite the valiant attempts of the defenders, the city fell. Seeing that the city was doomed, the Ming commander, Yang Yuan, led a detachment of 300 men out of the west gate, trying to break through the enemy lines. Despite being wounded twice, he and 100 of his men managed to escape the siege and headed to Cheonju, only to find the city deserted. Thus he continued towards Seoul. Back at Namwan, the Japanese, now in total control of the city, put combatants and civilians alike to the sword. Kainen, a priest who was accompanying the army as a physician, was so shocked by what he witnessed that he later wrote in his poems, "Whoever sees this, out of all of his days, today has become the rest of his life." As a final act of barbarism, they cut off the noses of 3,726 dead, salted them, and then shipped them back to Japan as proof to Hideyoshi that they had fought and defeated their opponents. Overall, in this second invasion, momentum had thus far been solely on Japan's side. However, the tide would begin to turn when a small number of Ming reinforcements, led by General Yang Hao, managed to ambush and defeat Japanese forces at Jiksan. This prevented any further incursions towards Seoul, and marked the furthest Japan would encroach into Korean territory. The daunting prospect of more gigantic Chinese armies joining the Koreans, and a forthcoming winter, meant that turning back south was the only realistic choice for the Japanese. With the invasion on land stalling in late 1597, it is here that Yi Sun-shin is thrust back into the limelight. After being reinstated as naval commander in the south, the admiral had only 13 ships to work with. Nevertheless, his mere presence cheered up the local population, who often greeted him as a savior. "Our admiral has come again, now we can be safe," shouted one local peasant. However great his bravery or ability, what could Admiral Yi do with only 13 ships against hundreds? Firstly, he set about reasserting discipline and order. Guards were posted to protect armories and storehouses. Cowardly officials were reprimanded and sent back to work. Officers and enlisted men were flogged for dereliction, and civilians were punished for any offense. Through these harsh means, Yi restored himself to what traditional Chinese military doctrine dubbed awesomeness, the mix of fear and respect a leader needed to command effectively.
Stop it. Wait. Awesomeness. Chinese term meaning unmanifest power to exert policy through a state or organization closest to the Roman Imperium. Okay.
Reaching his small fleet at Huryongpo, he immediately retrofitted all vessels to serve as makeshift turtle ships, with sturdy timber sides and spiked roofs to protect the crews. When this was done, Yi sailed kilometers west to Aranpo, which had a more open harbour. It was about this time that Yi received intelligence that the main Japanese war fleet was after him, so he retreated to the island of Chindo, further to the west. A 13-strong scout fleet tried to destroy Yi on the 17th of October, but was fought off without much difficulty. In the days after this minor skirmish, the main Japanese fleet arrived at Arampo and began building up its strength. As they did, Yi spent his time carefully observing the properties of surrounding bodies of water, noting the current speed, direction, and time of the tide. Of particular interest to the admiral was the narrow Myeongyang Channel, a stretch of water only 250 meters wide at its narrowest point. The current was also the fastest in all Korea, moving at a faster speed than Japanese ships could travel. This was a perfect place to make a final stand. On October 24th, Yi received further intelligence that a 200-strong Japanese fleet was closing in on his position. In response, he pulled his fleet through the Myeongyang Strait the next day, anchoring his ships in the open water just outside it. Beyond Yi's 13 combat vessels was a long line of fishing boats packed with refugees. By arranging these vessels in a mock battle line, the admiral hoped that the Japanese would assume his own squadron was merely the vanguard of a larger force. That night, with everything set as he wanted, Yi summoned his commanders to an audience, telling them that "He who seeks death shall live, he who seeks his life shall die." At dawn the next day, the main Japanese armada of 200 to 300 vessels approached the southern end of the Myeongyang Strait. As Yi had predicted, this huge mass of ships was unable to pass through the narrow channel of Myeongyang in one group, and thus began to split into separate squadrons. Everything was going according to Yi's plan. It was only when the first enemy ships...
Well, I think what helped Admiral Yi was his, and it's probably been said, I'll probably just repeating what the narrator said, is the knowledge of the current that goes through the Myeongyang channel. And I probably just butchered the pronunciation of that, even though he just said it.
Began to emerge into the open water that Yi ordered the attack. The Japanese fleet had not realized the Koreans were there, but they were finally notified by the cannons and fire arrows that began to attack them. However, as the admiral's flagship blasted the stunned enemy warships, the other ships in his fleet began to lag behind, witnessing the extraordinary odds they faced. However, threats of punishment and Yi's dogged determination motivated his captains to catch up and fight. At this point, the meager 13-ship Korean fleet was completely enveloped by at least 130 Japanese vessels. The battle that ensued was unlike anything the Korean Navy had ever experienced before. Outnumbered by biblical proportions, their stronger ships rammed their weaker counterparts with reinforced prows, blasted them from all sides with point-blank cannon fire, and set them alight with fire arrows. The massive Japanese flagship suffered the brunt of this battering and was soon in flames, and sunk shortly after. Despite outnumbering their foes by such a massive margin, the Japanese still could not even touch Yi's ships. Assault after assault was made up the Narrows by the numerically superior Japanese, but Yi's flagship stood like a castle at the mouth of Myeongyang, leading the defense which repelled each attack. Then, as the Great Admiral had anticipated, Myeongyang's northward current suddenly reversed, pulling the attacking Japanese ships back into the Narrows. They quickly became bunched together, some even smashing into one another and sinking. At this moment, the Koreans attacked with the tide at their back, inflicting massive casualties on the hapless Japanese fleet as the clash shifted back into the Narrows. By the time Hideyoshi's reinforced fleet managed to squeeze back through the Narrows and into open water, 31 of its ships had been destroyed.
Wow.
Once again, Admiral Yi had lost no ships at all. Badly shaken by their experience in the Channel, the Japanese armada fell back all the way to Busan. It would not gain access to the Yellow Sea, nor would it venture this far west to challenge Yi again. Unfortunately for the triumphant commander, bad news arrived a month after the victory at Myeongyang. His son had been killed defending his home from invading Japanese soldiers. Yi was deeply affected by this and fell into a deep depression. Carrying this weight on his shoulders, he nevertheless began to rebuild the Joseon Kingdom's naval power. By March of 1598, 61 warships were ready for combat, and a further 39 were under construction at the many shipyards of Korea. Accompanying the successes at sea were further victories on land. Ming reinforcements had arrived, and joining with the Korean forces, now pinned the land armies of Hideyoshi in their chain of coastal fortresses. Then, on September 18, 1598, Toyotomi Hideyoshi passed away, at the age of 62. This was the final nail in the coffin of Japan's attempted Korean conquest. One of the great Kwampaku's final orders was for the conflict to be brought to an end, and for all soldiers to return home. Both Hideyoshi's son Hideyori and other powerful daimyo, such as Tokugawa Ieyasu, were also eager to see the costly war stopped. In addition, the Ming were receptive to the idea of allowing Kanishi Yukinaga and the other Wajo garrisons to escape back to their homeland unharmed. The vengeful Koreans, however, were not going to accept this. Putting Korea's newfound dominance at sea to good use, Admiral Yi tightly blockaded Yukinaga inside Suncheon. Despite Yi's insistence that the Japanese would not be allowed to escape, Yukinaga's diplomatic pressure on the Chinese eventually allowed one ship to escape. This craft then signaled the rest of Japan's Wajo naval forces to rendezvous inside the bay at Sacheon to prepare for the voyage home. After Yukinaga failed to show up, the Japanese forces realized the situation he was in and sent 500 ships to break the blockade. Informed by scouts and local fishermen as to what was happening, Yi anticipated that the Japanese would take the direct route between Sacheon and Suncheon through the Noryang Strait. He was correct. Having drawn up his ships in the open sea just west of the narrow strait, a surprise attack was launched at 2 a.m. on the 17th of December 1598. Within hours, almost half the Japanese fleet was burned or sunk. Admiral Yi was in the thick of the fighting, wielding a bow personally when the allied Chinese flagship was attacked.
Wow.
By dawn, Japan's ships were retreating, and Yi ordered a ceaseless pursuit. As the Koreans caught up, a stray arquebus ball from a Japanese sharpshooter struck Yi Sun-shin in the left armpit.
Wow.
The great admiral was dead in minutes, but 450 out of the 500 enemy ships were shattered at Noryang. The tactical brilliance shown by Yi in this battle at Myeonyang, Hansando, and others had probably saved Korea. To this day, Admiral Yi Sun-shin is among Korea's most venerated historical figures. By the closing days of 1598, all Japanese forces had left Korea. With their departure, the devastating 6 years-long conflict was finally over. Nevertheless, the effects of the war would be profound for all three nations that took part in it. In 1600, the only prominent daimyo who avoided draining his resources in the costly Korean expedition, Tokugawa Ieyasu, was able to triumph over a loose coalition of his enemies at Sekigahara. Many of the daimyo who were defeated in that battle had fought in Korea, including Okita Hideiie, Mori Hidemoto, and Kanishi Yukinaga. As we might expect, Yukinaga's bitter rival, Kato Kiyomasa, fought on the other side, and finally got his own back. As a result of Sekigahara, the Tokugawa clan would rule Japan for 2.5 centuries to come. The victorious Ming and Joseon dynasties were gravely weakened by the war with Japan, making them easy prey for other invaders from the north. In 1644, the 278-year-old Ming dynasty finally collapsed due to a fatal cocktail of internal rebellion and Manchu intervention. Their subsequent Qing dynasty would last until 1912 and would prove to be generous overlords to the Koreans, whose hermit kingdom remained independent and largely cut off from the world until Japan's imperial restoration in the late 1800s. Special thanks to our sponsor Tokyo Treat and Sakura Co. Get $5 off a box of Japanese treats with our link and discount code in the description, and enter Sakura Co's free.
Feel free to check that out if you're interested. And what's the? Sorry, just checking. Okay. Okay, that's the end of that then. So yeah, this has been a great video, another great video by Kings and Generals. And if it's in the playlist, hang on. Let me just give me a sec. Let me see. Sorry, give me a sec. I'm probably wasting quite a lot of your time doing this. Sorry, I was just trying to... Just trying to see if I can find the playlist of about the Japanese history. Okay, I'll probably find it again off camera. So but it's been quite an interesting video, this one, especially the two parts I've reacted to. So oh god, I just seen on my OBS over here that it's how dark it's got outside. So anyway, if you like this reaction, please like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next